The reason that's important is because they don't want any surprises at the end in their bill, right? Their final invoice should reflect exactly what they shipped.
Hello and welcome to Cargo Shorts, brought to you by Old Dominion Freight Line. I'm your host, Jonathan Betts. Today we're talking about the importance of proper freight classification and packaging. Understanding your freight classification is a critical part of the shipping process. If your freight is not properly classified or you're using the wrong item numbers, you may not have the most accurate rates, which can lead to an unwelcome surprise on your final bill. So, understanding these classifications is critical to your business. But why is it a struggle for some? And what can be done to improve the system to streamline LTL shipments? Joining me to discuss this is someone who understands the system better than most, Erin Topper. She recently joined Old Dominion Freight Line as Director of Pricing Services after spending 18 years at the National Motor Freight Traffic Association, where she was responsible for managing the classification development process, including reviewing and updating packaging-related content, and writing proposals to amend National Motor Freight Classification. Erin, it's so great to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
As we mentioned, you spent about 20 years at the NMFTA helping craft the classification for LTL carriers nationwide. Okay, as you know, a lot of shippers can find this process a bit tedious and difficult to understand. You're an expert on this. You've seen it from the inside. Explain to us what goes into determining these classifications.
Absolutely. Let's keep in mind that the classification originated in 1936 when it was adopted from the rail classification. Since 1956, the classification has continued to evolve through the work at NMFTA. So when you're starting with a legacy product, it's kind of hard to start. You're not starting from ground zero, right? You're starting with what you already have in place. And NMFTA has to go through countless reviews of the classification provisions to now determine what the transportation characteristics are of that freight. It's not the same as it was in 1936 or in 1956, or perhaps even when it was last updated, which may have only been 20 years ago. So those transportation characteristics that NMFTA reviews are density. That's the primary, because as carriers, we are trying to maximize the vehicle cube and weight that is going on our vehicles. Then you also have handling. Is it palletized freight or individual boxes? Stowability. Is there a flat load-bearing surface for top freight? And also, is there lateral support for adjacent freight? And then finally, liability. You have to look at, is it overly susceptible to damage? Is it a fragile commodity? Is it hazardous in nature? Even if it's perishable. And by perishable, that could be something like live plants, or it could be something that is time sensitive. So all of those four factors are reviewed and go into the evaluation that is done on commodities in order to ensure that the classes that are assigned are appropriate for those four transportation characteristics.
Got it. So a lot of considerations, and it seems like it's changing frequently. But explain to us why this is even important. I mean, why should shippers really prioritize proper freight classification?
So for shippers, they first need to identify on the bill of lading what they're shipping. And the reason that's important is because they don't want any surprises at the end in their bill, right? Their final invoice should reflect exactly what they shipped. If they are upfront with what the product description is and or the NMFTA item number and subprovision, then we can make sure that we are properly billing it and rating it accordingly, right? If we don't know what's on our trucks, if we don't know what's in your package, we can't bill the freight properly. And that will ultimately result in some surprises at the end for the shipper, because we're going to have to change that. And chances are it's going to result in an increase.
So it really benefits the shipper in many ways.
It does, absolutely. They don't want surprises any more than we do, right? We want to make sure we know what's moving on our trucks, and they want to make sure that what they are quoted for a price is what they're going to be invoiced.
And so then why is this such a struggle for so many shippers? And what do you think needs to be done to help shippers correctly classify their freight?
So NMFTA has realized that, the classification is huge. However, over the last year, there have been 4 dockets, and I'll kind of explain the docket process in a minute, but there have been 4 dockets that have canceled and or consolidated literally thousands of items in the classification. So, at one point in time, the book itself was, probably 900, 1,000 pages, overly descriptive, overly specific NMFC items. And it was very difficult for shippers to really kind of dig into the NMFC and figure out exactly what the proper classification of their product was. Over the years, there's been a removal of specific items based off of material construction, how it's shipped, whether it's ship setup or KD. And really, there's been also a change in philosophy. And that change in philosophy goes to more being density based. Again, density being the primary transportation characteristic. So when density is the primary transportation characteristic and we're not having to worry about handling, stowability, and liability, then we are able to kind of consolidate and group those together. Those of you that are familiar with the classification might have noticed the entire furniture group and furniture parts group were significantly consolidated. About 180 items were consolidated into a single new item back in the February docket, which went into effect in April. So where originally shippers of furniture would have to figure out, okay, I have these 190 items, which one applies to mine? That was consolidated mostly into one single item.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nuance here and a lot of considerations to factor in, I guess, when these categories and processes are changed. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the packaging for a moment here. This is something that you also know very well. So this seems so basic to shipping, but also so often overlooked. Why is that? Why do you feel like a lot of shippers tend to overlook the importance of packaging?
I think there's two things. I think one is that you have a small shipper that may not be familiar with shipping all of that much, or maybe really familiar with packaging. When I give my educational presentations, a lot of time I joke about the non-professional type of development, or excuse me, the non-professional packaging development. Right? They take a look around their warehouse, they see what freight or what the freight is. They see if they have a pallet, maybe they can secure it to a pallet. Maybe they have some other packaging materials, or maybe they just strap it on the pallet and see what happens. So sometimes it does have to do with just a lack of education. Other times there's a philosophy that I've really truly never understood, and that is, if the carrier can see my freight, it won't get damaged. That's great if the carrier had control over the package the entire time it was in our system, right? In our trucks, it is a dynamic environment, right? There are shocks and vibrations, and the freight is going to move and shift within the vehicles. And it really, and the freight next to it really doesn't care that the carrier could see what it was to begin with, right? It is going to come in contact with that adjacent freight. It can be damaged mostly within the vehicle, denting, scuffing, crushing, things like that. All of those things can happen just as the freight moves as it's going down the road. So when we look at packaging, when going back to my packaging 101, right, the first function of packaging is to protect. The packaging is there to protect the freight. So shippers that take the time to properly protect their freight, they may go through an actual package design process with a packaging laboratory or a package design firm. They are going to have less of a chance of damage because they have actually already accounted for those dynamics and packaged it accordingly.
Well, there's also a sustainability component to all this too. As a lot of folks are getting more environmentally conscious, I know a lot of shippers are facing pressure to properly dispose of packaging. So how can carriers really strike that balance between the need for proper packaging to protect the item, but also not making too much packaging so that you're being wasteful?
Absolutely. Today, we really don't want to waste packaging. We don't want to overpackage. Overpackaging doesn't do really anything except use excessive materials. But underpackaging is going to be, while perhaps more sustainable in terms of the use of packaging, it may not be more sustainable in the long run. Finding that just right packaging is really what's key. For example, if you have underpackaging and you only spend, $1 on your packaging, that might be enough. That might be sufficient. But if it's not, and if you have a complete loss of product, or the product is damaged to the point that it's not recyclable, resalvageable, reusable in some way, then that freight or that product is going to end up in the landfill. So you've kind of lost that sustainability aspect because there was not enough packaging to make sure that it was going to get through the LTL distribution environment safely. Again, keeping in mind that we have all these, dynamics that they're going through. So making sure that you have the just right packaging is really key for shippers so that they're not over packaging, spending too much money, and it's not under packaging where you might result in a loss of the freight.
So then what can shippers and carriers do to work together to try to ensure the just right amount of packaging, the proper packaging is used?
So quite honestly, the onus is on the shipper to package their freight properly. The classification has numerous packaging rules and specifications that will help guide shippers in how to properly package their freight. Some of within the individual item descriptions, there will be minimum packaging requirements. It may be say something as simple as in boxes or crates. However, there are rules within the classification that define and specify the construction requirements for boxes and crates. If freight is not properly packaged in accordance with the NMFC, we have the option to deny all or part of that freight or of that claim based on insufficient or non-complying packaging. So it definitely benefits the shippers to know and understand the classification, the packaging rules. And again, on the flip side, if they're going to go to a packaging lab or a design firm, then that packaging should be great, right? Regardless of whether it meets the classification minimum package requirements, although it probably will, the fact that they go through a design process will help to ensure that it'll mitigate the chance of damage.
But I also think it underlines the importance of communication with the carrier, right? Making sure that you are in contact with them throughout the process and that there's transparency so that the two sides can work together to ensure the proper packaging, don't you think?
Absolutely. And, when we come across damage claims, as I alluded to at the beginning, I am not directly involved in claims in my current role. However, I have done a few packaging assessments for some of our customers. And so just kind of because I am new, because I'm trying to utilize my background, providing that information to our customers. Granted, OD has probably the best or one of the best claims ratios in the industry, and that goes to our level of service. So when we do have these instances where we're seeing high damage claims, that especially if they're a result of packaging, then we're definitely going to open up those lines of communication with our customers to ensure that we can continue to haul their freight in a safe manner with reducing the chance of damage.
Yeah, I know that OD spends twice as much on claims prevention than on paying claims. So explain to us why that is such a priority for OD.
We have, the best service in the industry, and that is a result of that investment. We want to make sure that as the freight is loaded into our trailers, that we are doing everything that we can to minimize that damage, to account for maybe that inappropriate or lack of packaging on certain handling units.
All right. Well, we also have some questions from shippers submitted to the show. So a reminder, if you would like us to answer your questions on Cargo Shorts, you can send us an email. We read them. It's marketing@odfl.com. Okay, so the first question comes from Jean. Jean is a traffic manager at a large manufacturer that ships to retailers. Her question is, the council frequently issues updates to the classification system throughout the year. Why do these changes occur? And do you worry that it's contributing to confusion with the shippers? So, central question, are there too many changes, frankly, to the process?
Right now, I think NMFTA is going through kind of some growing pains. Again, when the changes a few years ago were made to the classification, they were more individual commodity based. So you may only have a few items on any given proposal that were changed at one time. However, with these more wholesale, larger changes, yes, a lot is changing at once. But again, that is a directive to simplify things. So while there is an understanding and a recognition of those growing pains, the hope and the goal is that once, as time goes on, there will be less and less NMFC items for shippers to have to choose from, which would then make the process for them choosing those items much simpler.
Okay, the second question is also from a manufacturer. How have innovations in shipping products, manufacturers using lighter materials, for instance, affected classifications and shipping?
This is a great question. And honestly, when I did research on copy machines a number of years ago, the information in the original dockets from, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, can't remember at this point, showed, average densities and weights that were significantly higher than what we see today. Well, let's think about that. Copy machines, any type of machines back 70s and 80s were primarily made out of metal. All the components were metal. Very little plastic was incorporated. As we have continued to develop and re-engineer products, lighter materials are being used. And so that obviously has a significant contribution to the density of the freight as a whole. And certainly the way that something is packaged can affect the density. But, to this point, as products are made with lighter materials that are maybe less expensive, easier to manufacture, that is having a significant effect on the weight of the products and then ultimately the density of our handling units.
Fascinating insight, Erin. That's all the questions we have. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you spending the time to walk us through this kind of complicated process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we've learned a lot about the value of NMFC and packaging, so it's important to keep an eye on that bill of lading. Keeping up with the classification changes and staying in contact with your LTL carrier will ensure you're getting the most accurate rate for your shipments. If you enjoy this episode, be sure to check out our full Cargo Shorts podcast series. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, SoundCloud, and Google Podcast. If you enjoy this episode, please rate and review, share with your colleagues, and drop us an email at marketing@odfl.com. Visit the OD Outlook section of the Old Dominion Freight Line website at odfl.com, where you can find additional information on this topic. Thanks for listening.